The morning mist still clung to the Mississippi when Emma Caldwell walked into Riverside, Louisiana, carrying nothing but a crying baby, and a letter so waterlogged the ink had bled into illegible smears. Her clothes were damp, her auburn hair tangled with bits of marsh grass, and her green eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd seen too much in too short a time. Sheriff Tom Breaux was finishing his coffee at Magnolia's diner when old Mrs. Thibodeau burst through the door, her face flushed with excitement and concern. "Tom, you need to come quick. There's a woman walked into town looking like she'd been through hell itself. Got a baby with her, and she's saying something about her husband being taken by the river." Tom set down his cup and followed Mrs. Thibodeau outside. Riverside was the kind of small Louisiana town where everyone knew everyone, and strangers, especially ones in distress, drew immediate attention. A small crowd had already gathered around the young woman who stood swaying slightly in the middle of Main Street, clutching her infant close to her chest. Emma looked to be in her early 20s, pale and exhausted, with the kind of beauty that showed through even in her current state of distress. The baby in her arms couldn't have been more than 6 months old, and both mother and child looked like they hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. "Ma'am?" Tom approached slowly, his voice gentle. At 52, he'd been sheriff long enough to recognize trauma when he saw it. "I'm Sheriff Breaux. Folks say you might need some help." Emma's eyes darted around the crowd before settling on Tom's kind face. "My husband," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was taken by the river." She held out the damaged letter with shaking hands. Tom took it carefully, but the water damage had made most of it unreadable. He could make out fragments, "Sorry for what happened," and "Can't come back," and what looked like a signature but nothing coherent. "What's your name, honey?" asked Martha Landry, the diner owner, stepping forward with maternal instincts activated. Emma Caldwell. This is my daughter, Grace." Emma's voice cracked on the baby's name. "When did this happen?" "When was your husband taken?" Tom asked gently. Emma's eyes grew distant. 3 days ago. Maybe 4. Time doesn't seem right anymore." She swayed again, and Martha quickly moved to steady her. "Lord, have mercy. This child needs food and rest," Martha declared. "Tom, we can sort out the details later. Right now, she needs taking care of." Tom nodded. In small southern towns, hospitality wasn't just custom, it was survival. "Emma, why don't we get you and little Grace some food and a place to rest? Then we can talk about what happened." As Martha guided Emma toward the diner, the young woman looked back at the river visible between the buildings. "He said the water would keep us safe," she murmured. "He said the river protected those who respected it, but it took him anyway." Inside Magnolia's diner, Martha settled Emma at a corner booth and quickly brought sweet tea, biscuits, and a bowl of hearty gumbo. Emma ate mechanically, as if she'd forgotten how food was supposed to taste, while baby Grace fussed in her arms. "How long since you've slept?" Dr. Sarah Chen asked, having been summoned by Tom. The town's only physician was a young woman who'd moved to Riverside from New Orleans 2 years earlier, drawn by the community's need and the slower pace of life. "I don't remember," Emma said honestly. "We've been walking, trying to get away from the water, but it follows us everywhere down here." Dr. Chen examined both Emma and Grace with practiced efficiency. "They're dehydrated and malnourished, but otherwise healthy. The baby needs formula. She's not getting enough from nursing, and this young mother needs sleep more than anything. We'll set her up at the boarding house," Martha decided. "Mrs. Boudreaux always has a room available, and she's good with babies." As the afternoon wore on, more details emerged slowly. Emma claimed to be from a settlement upriver called Cedar Bend, a place none of the locals had heard of. She said her husband James had been a fisherman, that they'd lived in a small house right on the water. She insisted he'd been taken by the river, but grew agitated whenever pressed for specifics about how it happened. Could have been an accident, Tom confided to Dr. Chen as they watched Emma through the diner window. River's been running high with all the spring rain. Easy for someone to slip, get caught in the current. Maybe, Dr. Chen replied, but her tone suggested doubt. But look at her clothes, Tom. They're not just wet. They're stained with something that looks like it's been there for days. And that letter, why would someone write a letter if they were just going fishing? Young Pastor Michael Roberts arrived as the sun was setting, drawn by news of the stranger in need. At 28, he was still new to Riverside, having taken over the small Baptist church just a year earlier when the previous pastor retired. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said gently, approaching Emma's table. "I'm Pastor Roberts. I wanted you to know that our church has resources, clothing, food, whatever you and your daughter might need." Emma looked up at him with those haunted green eyes. "Do you believe the river has a memory, Pastor?" Michael paused, taken aback by the question. "I believe God's creation is mysterious and powerful. Why do you ask?" James always said the river remembered everything. Every person who'd ever touched its waters, every secret that was ever whispered on its banks. Emma's voice dropped to barely audible. He said it would remember him too. As night fell, Mrs. Boudreau led Emma and Grace to a small room above her boarding house. The older Cajun woman had raised 7 children of her own and recognized a mother in crisis. "You rest now, Cher," she said in her gentle Louisiana accent. "Whatever happened, it's behind you now. Riverside is a good place for starting over." But Emma stood at the room's single window, staring out at the dark water visible in the distance. "You can't start over when the river follows you everywhere," she whispered. Downstairs, Tom, Dr. Chen, and Pastor Roberts gathered with Martha and a few other concerned citizens to discuss the mysterious arrival. "I've been sheriff here for 15 years, Tom said, rubbing his chin. "Never heard of any Cedar Bend settlement upriver, and I know every family that fishes these waters." "Maybe it's not on any official maps," suggested Martha. "You know how some of the old Cajun families live. Off the grid, been there for generations." Dr. Chen shook her head. "It's not just that. Her story doesn't add up. She says her husband was taken 3 days ago, but she and the baby show signs of prolonged stress and malnourishment. This has been going on longer than 3 days." Pastor Roberts looked troubled. "She asked me about the river having memory. That's an odd thing to say about an accidental drowning." "What are you thinking, Doc?" Tom asked. Dr. Chen chose her words carefully. "I think Emma Caldwell is running from something. Maybe her husband's death wasn't an accident. Maybe she's not even a widow at all." Tom considered this. "You think she's lying about the whole thing?" "I think she's terrified," Dr. Chen replied. "And women don't usually run with babies unless they have very good reason to." Upstairs, Emma sat in the darkness, holding Grace, listening to the night sounds of a town she'd never been to before. In her pocket, alongside the ruined letter, was another piece of paper, one she hadn't shown anyone. This one was dry, carefully preserved, and contained information that would explain everything if anyone found it. But Emma had learned the hard way that some truths were more dangerous than lies, and some secrets were worth protecting, even if it meant carrying them forever. As the Mississippi rolled past Riverside in the darkness, Emma Caldwell began planning how long she could stay in this kind town before her past caught up with her, because she knew, with the certainty of someone who'd lived through hell, that the river might have taken James, but it wasn't finished with her. 2 weeks into Emma's stay in Riverside, the town had begun to weave her into its daily rhythm. She helped Martha at the diner during lunch rushes, accepted donated clothes from the church, and allowed Dr. Chen to monitor Grace's improving health. To outside observers, she was simply a young widow trying to rebuild her life after tragedy. But Sheriff Tom Breaux noticed things that others missed. "She never goes near the water," he mentioned to Dr. Chen as they watched Emma hanging laundry behind the boarding house. "Most folks here grow up on the river, use it for everything. She won't even walk down Main Street when she can see the dock." Dr. Chen had made similar observations. "And she never talks about her husband except in the vaguest terms. No specific memories, no shared jokes, no mention of how they met. It's like she's describing a character from a book rather than someone she lived with." Despite their suspicions, both had grown protective of Emma and Grace. The young mother worked hard, caused no trouble, and clearly adored her daughter. Whatever secrets she carried, they sensed she posed no danger to the community. Emma's carefully constructed routine was disrupted on a Tuesday morning when a stranger arrived in Riverside asking questions. Detective Ray Tompkins from the Louisiana State Police was a tall, weathered man in his 40s who carried himself with the weariness of someone who'd seen too much of humanity's darker side. He found Tom at the sheriff's office, studying missing persons reports. "Sheriff Breaux?" "I'm Detective Tompkins, State Police. I'm looking for a woman and infant who might have passed through your area recently." Tom's hand instinctively moved toward the coffee pot, a Louisiana gesture of hospitality that bought thinking time. "What's the nature of your inquiry, Detective?" Tompkins pulled out a photograph. "Emma Rousseau, 23 years old, last seen in Baton Rouge 2 weeks ago with her 6-month-old daughter. She's wanted for questioning in connection with her husband's death." Tom studied the photograph. It was definitely Emma, though taken in better times. She was smiling, her hair styled, wearing what looked like a church dress. "What kind of death are we talking about?" James Rousseau, 28, was found floating in the industrial canal. Initially looked like an accident or possible suicide, but some evidence has come to light suggesting foul play. The wife disappeared the same night, took the baby and what cash they had in the house. Tom kept his expression neutral. "And you think she might have come through here? We've been checking small towns along the river. She grew up in rural Louisiana, might head somewhere she felt safe." Tompkins leaned forward. "Have you seen her, Sheriff?" The pause before Tom answered was nearly imperceptible. "Can't say I have, Detective, but I'll keep an eye out and call you if anyone matching that description shows up." Tompkins handed over his card. "Appreciate it. Woman's probably scared, confused. If she turns up, she needs to know that talking to us is her best option. The longer she runs, the worse this looks for her." After Tompkins left, Tom sat staring at the photograph. Emma Rousseau, not Caldwell. And James hadn't been taken by the river in the mystical sense she'd implied. He'd been found dead in Baton Rouge's industrial district, 90 miles away. Tom walked to the diner, where Emma was wiping down tables while Grace napped in a makeshift crib Martha had set up in the kitchen. "Emma," he said quietly, "we need to talk." Something in his tone made her freeze. "What about?" "About James Rousseau, about Baton Rouge, about why the state police are looking for you." Emma's face went white. She glanced toward the kitchen where Grace slept, then back at Tom. "I can explain." "I hope so, because Detective Tompkins seemed pretty convinced you know more about your husband's death than you've let on." Emma sank into the nearest chair, her hands shaking. "James is dead?" The genuine shock in her voice gave Tom pause. "You didn't know?" I knew something terrible had happened. But dead? Tears started flowing. Oh God, Grace will never know her father. Dr. Chen arrived for her usual afternoon coffee and immediately sensed the tension. What's going on? Tom quickly explained about Tompkins' visit. Dr. Chen sat beside Emma, her medical training making her naturally supportive even as questions swirled. Emma, you need to tell us the truth, Tom said gently. All of it. Because running from the police never ends well, especially with a baby. Emma was quiet for a long moment, holding Grace close. Finally, she began to speak. James wasn't my husband. He was my boyfriend and Grace's father, but we were never married. We lived together in a trailer park outside Baton Rouge. Her voice was flat, distant. James dealt drugs, small-time stuff, mostly to support his own habit. I knew it was wrong, but I was 19 when I met him, pregnant and alone. He took care of us. Tom and Dr. Chen exchanged glances but stayed quiet. 3 weeks ago, James came home scared, really scared. Said he'd gotten mixed up with some dangerous people, owed them money he didn't have. Said they'd threatened to hurt me and Grace if he didn't pay up. Emma's voice broke. That night, he gave me all the cash we had, about $300, and told me to take Grace and run. Where were you supposed to go? Dr. Chen asked. He said to head toward the river parishes, find a small town where strangers could blend in. Said if anyone asked, I should say he'd been taken by the river. It would sound like an accident to people who knew how dangerous the water could be. Tom leaned forward. But you didn't know he was actually dead? Emma shook her head vigorously. I thought he was hiding, maybe trying to work things out with the people he owed. The letter, the ruined one I showed you, that was supposed to be instructions on where to meet him later, but it got soaked when I crossed a creek, and I couldn't read it anymore. Why didn't you just tell us the truth when you arrived? Dr. Chen asked. Because I was terrified. I had no ID, no proof Grace was mine, no way to explain why I was running. And James always said if anything happened, to never trust the police, because they'd just send us back to whoever was hunting us. The story had the ring of truth, but Tom knew it also put Emma in tremendous danger. Emma, those people James owed money to, do you know who they were? Number James never told me details. Said it was safer for me not to know. Tom rubbed his temples. And now the state police think you might have killed James yourself. But I didn't. I would never. Emma's distress was causing Grace to fuss. He was trying to protect us. Everything he did was to keep us safe. Dr. Chen had been thinking while Emma talked. Tom, if Emma goes back to Baton Rouge, she's walking into a murder investigation where she's the prime suspect. And if James was really killed by drug dealers, she and Grace could still be in danger. Tom knew she was right. Emma, I believe your story. But Detective Tompkins is going to come back. Probably with more questions and maybe a warrant. We need to figure out how to handle this before that happens. Emma stood up abruptly. I should leave. Tonight, I've brought enough trouble to your town. Absolutely not, Martha said firmly, emerging from the kitchen where she'd been listening. Child, you're not going anywhere with that baby. This is where you belong now. Pastor Roberts, who'd arrived for his usual afternoon visit, had heard enough of the conversation to understand the situation. Emma, running won't solve anything, and it won't bring James back. But what if they arrest me? What happens to Grace? Tom had been a sheriff long enough to know that sometimes the law and justice weren't the same thing. We'll figure it out. But first, we need to get you a lawyer. And we need to make sure Grace is protected no matter what happens. As evening fell over Riverside, Emma found herself surrounded by people who'd known her for only 2 weeks, but were already treating her like family. It was a stark contrast to the isolation and fear she'd lived with in Baton Rouge. "Why are you all helping me?" she asked, as the group discussed legal strategies and childcare options. Mrs. Boudreau, who'd been quietly listening, spoke up in her gentle Cajun accent. "Because sometimes the river brings us exactly who we need, Cher, and sometimes we're meant to be someone's safe harbor." But as they planned Emma's defense, none of them noticed the dark sedan that had been parked across from the diner for the past hour, or the man inside who'd been watching Emma through telephoto lens. Because while the state police were looking for a murder suspect, others were still looking for the woman who might be able to identify James Rousseau's real killers. And those people played by very different rules than Detective Tompkins. The attack came 3 days later, just after dawn. Emma was feeding Grace when she heard car doors slamming outside the boarding house. Through her window, she saw 2 men in expensive suits walking purposefully toward the front entrance. Men who looked nothing like the friendly faces she'd grown accustomed to in Riverside. Her blood turned to ice. These weren't police officers. These were the kind of men James had warned her about. "Mrs. Boudreau," Emma called out, her voice urgent but controlled. The older woman appeared immediately, took one look at Emma's face, and understood. "Backstairs," Mrs. Boudreau whispered. "Go to the church. Pastor Roberts will know what to do." Emma grabbed Grace and the small bag she'd kept packed, old habits from life with James, and slipped down the rear staircase just as heavy footsteps echoed in the front hallway. She could hear one of the men speaking to Mrs. Boudreau in a tone that was polite, but carried an underlying threat. "We're looking for a young woman with a baby. Emma Rousseau. We believe she's staying here. I'm sorry, but I don't know anyone by that name." Mrs. Boudreau replied with the calm authority of someone who'd raised 7 children and feared nothing. "Ma'am, we know she's here. This doesn't have to be difficult." Emma reached the kitchen door just as she heard Mrs. Boudreau's voice grow steel-hard. "Young man, I've lived in this town for 73 years. If I say someone isn't here, they aren't here. Now, I suggest you leave before I call Sheriff Breaux." Emma slipped out the back door and ran toward the church, her heart pounding so hard she was afraid it might wake Grace. Behind her, she could hear raised voices, and knew Mrs. Boudreau was buying her precious time. The Baptist church sat on a small hill overlooking Main Street, and Emma reached it just as Pastor Roberts was arriving for early morning prayers. One look at her terrified face told him everything. Inside, now. He ushered her through the side entrance and into his small office. "What's happening? The men James owed money to. They found me." Emma was breathing hard, Grace starting to cry from the jostling. "They're at the boarding house." Pastor Roberts immediately called Tom, who arrived within minutes with Dr. Chen. The 4 of them huddled in the church office while Emma explained what she'd overheard. "They called me Emma Rousseau. They know exactly who I am." Her voice was shaking. "James said these people don't just hurt you, they hurt everyone around you. Mrs. Boudreau could be in danger because of me." Tom was already on his radio, calling for backup from the parish sheriff's department. "Did you see what they were driving? Black sedan, Louisiana plates. 2 men in suits that cost more than I used to make in a month." Dr. Chen had taken Grace and was trying to calm the baby while thinking practically. "Emma, you said James never told you who these people were. But you must have seen something, heard something. Why else would they be hunting you so desperately?" Emma was quiet for a moment, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small cell phone. "James gave me this the night he told me to run. Said if anything happened to him, there might be something on it that could help the police, but I was too scared to look." Tom took the phone carefully. "Emma, this could be evidence, important evidence. I know, but it could also get us all killed." Pastor Roberts had been listening while keeping watch out the window. "Emma, sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks, and sometimes God puts us in situations where we have to choose between our own safety and justice for others." Before Emma could respond, Tom's radio crackled. "Sheriff, this is Deputy Martinez. We've got a situation at the Boudreaux boarding house. 2 men are demanding to search the premises. They're claiming to be federal agents, but their credentials don't check out." Tom grabbed his hat. "I'm on my way. Doc, can you stay with Emma?" "Wait," Emma said, standing up. "If they're not real federal agents, then who are they?" Dr. Chen had been thinking the same thing. "Tom, what if they're private security? Or worse, what if they're working for whoever killed James?" The implications hit everyone simultaneously. If these men were killers masquerading as authorities, then Emma wasn't just a witness. She was the only person who could potentially identify James's murderers. Tom made a quick decision. "Emma, I need you to call Detective Tompkins. Tell him exactly what's happening here. He may not trust you, but he'll definitely want to know if murder suspects are impersonating federal agents in his jurisdiction." Emma's hand shook as she dialed the number on Tompkins' card. When he answered, she spoke quickly. "Detective Tompkins, this is Emma Rousseau. I'm in Riverside, Louisiana, and there are men here claiming to be federal agents looking for me. Sheriff Bro says their credentials are fake." The line was quiet for a moment. "Miss Rousseau, where exactly in Riverside are you?" "The Baptist Church." "Detective, I didn't kill James, but I think I know who did, and they're here now. Stay exactly where you are. I'm 40 minutes out with backup. Don't let anyone except Sheriff Bro near you until I arrive." As Emma hung up, they heard vehicles roaring down Main Street. Through the church windows, they could see the black sedan speeding away, followed closely by Tom's patrol car and 2 parish sheriff's vehicles. "They're running," Pastor Roberts observed. Dr. Chen was studying the cell phone Emma had given Tom. "Emma, before the detective gets here, you need to decide how much you're willing to risk to see justice done. Because whatever's on this phone, it's important enough that people are willing to kill for it." Emma looked at Grace, sleeping peacefully in Dr. Chen's arms despite the chaos around her. She thought about James, who, despite his flaws, had tried to protect them at the cost of his own life. She thought about Mrs. Boudreaux, who'd lied to dangerous men to keep her safe. She thought about this entire town that had welcomed a stranger with no questions asked. "I want to look at the phone," Emma said quietly. Tom's voice came over Dr. Chen's radio. "Suspects are in custody. Emma, you're safe to come out now." But Emma was already scrolling through James's phone, and what she found made her sink into the nearest chair. "Oh my God," she whispered. "James was working with the police. He was an informant." The phone contained months of text messages between James and someone identified only as Detective M. The messages detailed drug transactions, money laundering operations, and names of people involved in a trafficking ring that stretched from New Orleans to Baton Rouge. "He wasn't just some small-time dealer," Emma said, her voice filled with wonder and grief. "He was helping build a case against major criminals, and they found out." Dr. Chen read over Emma's shoulder. "Emma, this makes you more than just a witness. If James shared any of this information with you, you could be the key to bringing down an entire criminal network." When Detective Tompkins arrived an hour later, he found Emma sitting in the church sanctuary, holding Grace and staring at James's phone. The evidence it contained would indeed help convict a dozen people involved in drug trafficking and money laundering. But more importantly, it proved that James Rousseau had died a hero, trying to protect not just his family but countless potential victims of the criminals he'd been helping to expose. "Ms. Rousseau," Detective Tompkins said gently, "I owe you an apology, and your daughter's father was a braver man than any of us realized." As evening fell over Riverside, Emma walked down Main Street for the first time since arriving, no longer running from her past, no longer hiding from the river. The water that had seemed so threatening now looked peaceful in the fading light. Mrs. Boudreau met her on the boarding house porch. "How you feeling, Cher?" Emma looked down at Grace, then back at the woman who'd risked her own safety to protect them. Like maybe the river brought us exactly where we needed to be. But Emma's sense of peace was about to be tested in ways she couldn't imagine, because while James's killers were in custody, the legal system that would determine her and Grace's future was just getting started. 6 months later, Emma stood in the courthouse in Baton Rouge, holding Grace and watching as the last of James's killers was sentenced to life in prison. The evidence on James's phone, combined with Emma's testimony, had brought down a criminal network that had operated with impunity for years. Detective Tompkins approached her after the sentencing. "Emma, I want you to know, James's work likely saved dozens of lives. The trafficking ring we broke up was planning to expand operations into drugs that would have killed kids." Emma nodded, feeling a complex mix of pride and grief. "I just wish he could have lived to see them brought to justice. In a way he did, through you." The legal proceedings had been grueling, but they'd also been healing. Emma had learned that James had been clean for over a year before his death, that his work with the police had been voluntary, and that every risk he'd taken had been motivated by his desire to give Emma and Grace a better life. More importantly, she'd learned that running from the truth never solved anything, but facing it with the support of people who cared could transform even the darkest chapters into something meaningful. As Emma and Grace prepared to leave Baton Rouge for the last time, Emma's court-appointed attorney pulled her aside. "Emma, there's one more thing. James had a life insurance policy through his legitimate job at the marina. Since you were listed as the beneficiary and Grace's mother, you're entitled to a settlement of $50,000. Emma stared at him in shock. "But we weren't married." "Louisiana recognizes common law relationships under certain circumstances. James clearly considered you family, and the law agrees." The money would change everything, giving Emma the security to finish her education, to provide for Grace's future, to build the kind of life James had dreamed of for them. But as she drove back toward Riverside that evening, Emma realized the money was less important than what she'd found in the small Louisiana town that had taken them in. The entire town turned out for Emma's homecoming. Martha had closed the diner early to prepare a celebration feast. Pastor Roberts had organized a prayer service of Thanksgiving. Mrs. Boudreau had spent the week baking Emma's favorite beignets. "Welcome home, Cher," Mrs. Boudreau said, wrapping Emma in a fierce hug. "We never doubted you'd come back to us." Dr. Chen examined Grace and marveled at how much the little girl had grown. "She's thriving, Emma. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Sheriff Tom presented Emma with something unexpected, a job offer. "We need a victim's advocate at the sheriff's department. Someone who understands what it's like to be scared and alone and dealing with the legal system. The pay isn't much, but it comes with benefits and the chance to help people who are going through what you went through." Emma felt tears welling up. "Tom, I don't have any formal training." "You have the most important qualification. You've been there. And you survived it with grace and courage. And that's worth more than any degree." That evening, As the celebration wound down, Emma found herself walking along the riverbank for the first time since arriving in Riverside. The water that had once seemed so threatening now reflected the peaceful lights of the town that had become her home. Pastor Roberts joined her as she stood watching the current flow past. "Seems different now, doesn't it?" he said. "Everything seems different. I keep thinking about what James said, that the river remembers everything. Maybe he was right, but not in the way I thought." "What do you mean?" Emma shifted Grace to her other arm. "I think the river remembers acts of kindness just as much as it remembers tragedies. Mrs. Boudreau lying to dangerous men to protect us. You opening the church doors without question. Dr. Chen caring for Grace like she was her own family. Tom believing in my innocence when he had every reason not to." Pastor Roberts smiled. "So, the river brought you exactly what you needed." "No," Emma said, her voice filled with quiet certainty. "The river brought me home." 6 months later, Emma's work as victims advocate had helped dozens of people navigate the legal system with dignity and hope. She'd enrolled in night classes to get her GED, then started taking courses toward a degree in social work. Grace was walking now, toddling around the boarding house and charming everyone in town. But the most significant change came when Emma met David Tran, a social worker from New Orleans who'd come to Riverside to consult on a domestic violence case. He was kind, patient, and completely unintimidated by Emma's complicated past. "I don't understand why that doesn't bother you," Emma said during one of their long conversations. "The fact that I lived with a drug dealer, that I was a suspect in a murder case, that I have a daughter with a man I wasn't married to." David smiled. "Because that's not who you are. That's just what happened to you. Who you are is someone who protected her child, who had the courage to testify against killers, who turned her own trauma into a way to help other people." On a warm spring evening, exactly 1 year after her arrival in Riverside, Emma stood on the riverbank again, this time not alone. Grace played at her feet while David helped Tom set up chairs for Emma's birthday party. The first birthday celebration she'd had since she was a teenager. The entire town had turned out once again, this time not for a crisis, but for pure joy. Martha had made Emma's favorite cake. Mrs. Boudreau had strung lights along the dock. Dr. Chen had brought gifts for Grace, and Pastor Roberts had prepared a blessing for the meal. As the sun set over the Mississippi, Emma realized that she'd finally learned what James had been trying to tell her about the river's memory. It didn't just remember the bad things, it remembered everything, including the good. Including the night a scared young woman had walked into a strange town carrying her baby and found a family she'd never expected. "What are you thinking about?" David asked, settling beside her as the party continued around them. Emma watched Grace laugh as Tom taught her to feed ducks at the water's edge. "I'm thinking about how sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out what you really need." "And what did you really need?" Emma looked around at the people who'd saved her life in ways that had nothing to do with rescue and everything to do with love. A place where telling the truth doesn't make you dangerous. People who see your potential instead of just your past. And maybe, most importantly, what? Emma picked up Grace, who immediately snuggled into her mother's arms with the complete trust that only children possess. The chance to be someone my daughter can be proud of. As the party continued into the night, Emma found herself thinking one last time about the letter that had brought her to Riverside, the ruined, unreadable message that she'd thought contained instructions from James. She'd never learned what it actually said, but she'd come to understand that it didn't matter. Sometimes the most important messages aren't written in words. Sometimes they're written in the kindness of strangers, in the courage to tell the truth, in the faith that tomorrow can be better than today. The river flowed past Riverside as it had for centuries, carrying away the old while bringing in the new. And on its banks, a young woman who'd once been lost had finally found her way home. Not to a place, but to herself, and to the understanding that family isn't just about blood. Sometimes it's about the people who choose to love you when you can't love yourself. Emma Rousseau had walked into town carrying her baby and a broken letter, claiming her husband had been taken by the river. She'd been telling the truth, just not the whole truth. But now, surrounded by the family she'd chosen and who'd chosen her in return, Emma finally understood that the river hadn't taken James to punish them. It had carried him to the place where he could do the most good, and then it had carried her to the place where she could heal. The broken letter had been destroyed by water, but the love it represented had survived everything. And that, Emma knew, was the only message that really mattered.